Right, let's just get real for a second here. If you're anything like me, you probably grew up watching those classic outdoor survival shows or reading those old school adventure novels, thinking that if you ever got stuck out in the deep bush during a brutal winter, all you'd really need to survive is a roaring fire, a solid lean-to, and a thick wool blanket. Like, that's the ultimate frontier dream, right? Yeah, honestly, I used to think the exact same thing. I figured those old-timers were basically indestructible. But then, about 3 weeks ago, I was digging through some digitized late 19th century Hudson's Bay Company logbooks and Northern Police archives, and let me tell you, I was completely floored. Hold up, let me actually double check my notes on this one specific log from the Yukon Territory. Because when I first read it, I thought the archivist who transcribed it was just completely out to lunch. But no, it's right here. It turns out that the absolute biggest killer out there in the absolute dead of winter, when it's dropping down to -40 or -50, it wasn't the sudden blizzards, it wasn't timber wolves, and it wasn't starvation. It was something way more sneaky, happening right inside their own shelters while they were trying to catch some sleep. We are talking about a single, fundamental mistake that turned their own bedding into a literal ice trap. Think about that for a second. You do everything right all day, you build your shelter, you harvest your firewood, you get out of the wind, and then the very thing you do to try and stay warm is the exact thing that ends up sealing your fate. It's wild. So today, we're going to dive deep into what was actually going on out there on the winter trap lines. Look at why the legendary ruggedness of these frontier boys was sometimes a total myth, and figure out exactly how a person can freeze to death from the inside out while wrapped in a pile of heavy furs. Let's look at how these guys were actually operating back then, because the old folklore really sells you this romanticized dream that these tough frontier trappers had it all figured out. You see the old paintings or the movie depictions, these guys looking totally stoic in their buckskins, smoking pipes by a cozy fire. But when you start reading the actual journal records left behind by clerks and district inspectors, man, it is just heartbreakingly clueless. The reality of the Canadian backcountry in January is an absolute gong show if you don't respect the physics of cold. Let's trace a typical scenario based on these records. Say it's 1888. Somewhere deep in the boreal forest of northern Alberta or the Saskatchewan River country, you've got a trapper who has been humping it through waist-deep snow all day, checking his line, carrying heavy gear. He's exhausted. His daylight is completely gone. Because up north, the sun basically quits on you by 3 in the afternoon, and the temperature is crashing hard. It's hitting -35, and the air feels so brittle it practically cuts your lungs when you breathe. Now this guy is freezing, so he does what anyone would do. He scrambles to get a shelter set up. He builds a classic brush lean-to, or clears out a small space under a heavy spruce canopy. He throws down some pine boughs, builds a massive blazing fire right in front of his camp, and then he gets ready to turn in. He's got these beautiful, thick beaver pelts, heavy caribou hides, or maybe a couple of those iconic 4-point wool blankets. He wraps himself up tightly, completely cocooning himself from the freezing air, and he thinks he's golden. He thinks he's safe for the night, eh? But here is where the compounding errors start piling up, and it's a total disaster in slow motion. The first major blunder is something we still see people doing today when they try winter camping for the first time without proper training. This trapper is so terrified of the freezing air hitting his face that he pulls the blankets or the heavy furs completely over his head. He tucks himself in so tight that there isn't a single gap left for the outside air to get in. Now, on paper, that sounds cozy, right? You're trapping your body heat. But functionally, you are actively sabotaging your own survival. Every single time that guy takes a breath inside that sealed fur cocoon, he is exhaling warm, highly moisture-laden air. We don't really think about it, but human breath is incredibly humid. In normal conditions, that moisture just dissipates into the room. But when you are trapped inside a tight envelope of freezing fabrics and hides, that warm, wet breath has nowhere to go. It immediately rises, hits the colder layers of the blanket or the fur right above his face, and it condenses. Now, because the ambient temperature outside that little bundle is absolutely frigid, that condensation doesn't just stay wet. Within an hour or two, it starts to freeze. It creates this thin, microscopic crust of frost on the interior lining of the bedding. And as the night goes on, and he keeps breathing, that frost layer keeps building up, thicker and thicker, turning into solid ice. But it gets so much worse than that, because it isn't just the breath. Let's look at the second part of this fatal chain reaction, body sweat. This trapper has been working like a dog all day, right? His core temperature is elevated, and even though he's freezing on the outside, his body is still trying to regulate itself. He gets under those heavy furs, The immediate radiant heat from his body makes him feel warm, and because he's wrapped up so tight, he starts to sweat. Now, in the summer, sweat is your best friend. It evaporates and cools you down. But in a sub-zero survival situation, moisture is an absolute death sentence. The sweat acts into his heavy wool clothing and the inner layers of the fur hides. Wool is great because it can retain some warmth when wet, but even wool has its absolute limits when you're dealing with extreme northern elements. As the fire outside his shelter inevitably starts to die down around 2 or 3 in the morning, because nobody can keep a fire roaring perfectly, while they're fast asleep, the temperature inside that shelter plummets instantly. When that fire drops, the zone of freezing air closes in. The heat source is gone. Now that moisture that soaked into his clothing from his sweat, and that heavy layer of frost that formed around his head from his breath, they start to completely shift the thermal dynamics of his gear. Water conducts heat roughly 25 times faster than air. Let me repeat that, because it's the single most important rule of cold weather survival. Water moves heat 25 times faster than still air. So, instead of those blankets trapping a nice, insulating layer of dead air around his body, the wet clothing and the icy crust on the furs start drawing his body heat away at an astronomical rate. His own bedding becomes a massive thermal siphon, sucking the core warmth right out of his torso and blasting it into the freezing night. And the terrifying thing is, because he's completely exhausted from a brutal day of trekking through the bush, he doesn't even wake up when it starts happening. The deep physical fatigue, combined with the early stages of mild hypothermia, just drugs his brain. He stays fast asleep while his body temperature quietly slips down into the danger zone. Before we get into how the smart trappers and the indigenous guides actually fix this physics problem, I want to do a quick check-in with you guys. If you've ever done any Winter Crown land camping, or honestly if you figure you'd last a single night out in the bush during a true Yukon winter, drop a right on or a hooped in the comments section right now, just so I know who's actually keeping up with this, and who understands how fast things can go sideways out there. It's a totally different ballgame when the thermometer drops past 30, let me tell you. So let's get back to the grim reality of these logbooks, because some of these accounts are just absolutely wild to read. There's a report from a Northwest Mounted Police patrol back in the winter of 1894, near the Athabasca region. They came across a small winter camp that had been set up by an independent trapper who had come up from the States. The guy had a solid shelter, plenty of dry wood stacked up, and he had an absolute mountain of high-quality buffalo robes and wool blankets. By all conventional logic, this guy should have been totally fine. He had thousands of dollars worth of winter gear by 19th century standards. But when the patrol found him, he was frozen solid right in his bed. The fire had burned down to ash, obviously. But the weirdest thing noted by the constable in his report was that the top 3 inches of the man's heavy wool blankets were completely stiff, like a sheet of plywood. It was a solid, impermeable crust of ice, formed entirely from his own breath, and the moisture trapped inside his sleeping bundle. He had literally built an igloo of ice right around his own chest and face, and it just froze him out. He was hooped the minute he tucked himself in that way, completely giving his head a shake to think that more blankets automatically meant more safety. And honestly, let's talk about the ground for a second, because that's the third element of this sleeping mistake that people completely overlook. A lot of these rookie trappers would put all their effort into covering themselves from the top. They'd pile on 4 or 5 layers of heavy hides on top of their bodies, but they would only throw down a thin layer of spruce boughs on the frozen ground beneath them. They figured, hey, I've got a fire out front, and the ground is solid, so I'm fine. But the ground is a giant, infinite heat sink. Frozen dirt or snow will hold on to the cold and continuously draw energy from anything warm placed on top of it. If you don't have adequate insulation underneath you, it doesn't matter if you have 20 blankets on top. The cold from the earth will just reach right up and pull your core temperature down through conduction. The weight of your body compresses your clothing and your bedding underneath you, crushing those tiny pockets of insulating air down to nothing. So the bottom layer of your sleeping setup becomes incredibly thin, leaving almost zero thermal barrier between your warm back and the solid, frozen Canadian shield. It's like sleeping directly on a block of ice. Alright, enough of the grim details. Let's talk about the guys who actually got it right, because people obviously survived out there for thousands of years without modern synthetic sleeping bags or Gore-Tex bivvies. The seasoned indigenous hunters, the Cree, the Dene, the Inuit, and the old-school voyageurs who actually bothered to learn from them, they understood the simple physics of cold weather sleeping perfectly. They knew exactly how to manage moisture and airflow so they wouldn't turn into a human popsicle by 4 in the morning. First off, they never, ever covered their mouths or noses with their bedding. If you look at historical accounts of how experienced northern woodsmen slept, They always kept their faces completely exposed to the open air, no matter how cold it got. Yeah, your nose gets cold, and your cheeks feel frosty, but that's just surface discomfort. By keeping your airway open to the outside, every single breath of warm, humid air you exhale is pushed completely away from your bedding and into the open atmosphere, where it can safely freeze on the trees or the shelter walls instead of inside your blankets. To protect their faces from the biting wind, they didn't use blankets, they used the natural design of their shelter, or built a small reflector wall behind their fire to bounce a gentle, consistent stream of radiant heat right across their sleeping area. This created a small microclimate of moving, warm air that would carry the moisture away from their faces without letting the frost settle on their gear. Secondly, they understood that insulation underneath the body is 10 times more important than insulation on top. An experienced woodsman would spend an hour harvesting a massive, thick mattress of fresh, bouncy balsam fir or spruce boughs. We are talking a layer that's at least a foot or two deep before you even sit on it. When you lay down on a properly constructed bough bed, your body weight compresses it down, but it still leaves a thick, springy matrix of thousands of tiny air pockets trapped between the needles and branches. This creates a massive barrier of dead air that completely disconnects your body from the frozen ground below. But the real secret weapon of the high-retention survival setup was how they managed their clothing and the materials they used. They didn't sleep in the same clothes they wore while working. If you crawl into your bed wearing the damp, sweat-soaked wool tunic you've been trekking in all day, you are already starting the night at a massive disadvantage. The smart trappers would change into a dedicated, completely dry set of lightweight inner clothing specifically kept for sleeping, often made of fine, breathable caribou skin or soft, dry wool. And instead of sealing themselves up in an airtight cocoon, they used the natural properties of specific furs to create a breathable, self-ventilating system. Caribou fur, for instance, is totally unique because each individual hair is completely hollow. It contains trapped air inside the hair shaft itself. This makes caribou hides incredibly lightweight, unbelievably insulating, and highly effective at letting small amounts of body moisture escape outward through the fur, without condensing into a solid sheet of ice right against your skin. They would lay out their furs loosely, allowing just enough natural airflow to let the body's natural humidity escape, while the hollow hairs retained an absolute wall of warmth around their torso. It's just wild to think about how a lack of basic physics understanding cost so many lives during the fur trade era. You have these incredibly tough, brave men who could carry 200-pound packs over portages for weeks on end, completely brought down by a bit of frozen breath because they wanted to tuck their noses in warm for the night. It just goes to show you that out in the Canadian bush, brute force and sheer toughness will only get you so far. If you don't know how to handle moisture, the winter will find that weak spot and it will absolute shut you down. Anyway, that's pretty much the deep dive for today, guys. I just really wanted to share that because when you look at the actual history, it completely changes how you view wilderness survival. It's not always about fighting off some massive, dramatic threat. Most of the time, it's just about paying attention to the tiny details and making sure you aren't accidentally setting a trap for yourself when you close your eyes. If you enjoyed this look into the old frontier archives, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, and share it with someone who loves the outdoors. Stay safe out there on the trails, keep your gear dry, give your head a shake if you're still tucking your face inside your sleeping bag, and we'll catch you on the next one. Right on!